The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, Exempt and Non-Exempt Employees, presented by our sponsor, Heffernan. We're so happy you can join us. My name is Amanda Ramatar, and I will be your moderator today, and I will also be monitoring questions you may have during the session. Before we open up the session, let's review a couple of key items. All of the webinar materials we discuss can be found at the URL currently showing on your screen. I will be sharing this URL in a follow-up email, so don't feel like you need to write it down right now. If you have trouble with your internet connection during the webinar, we recommend leaving the presentation and logging back in. We do not control the audio, your devices control the audio. So if you have audio difficulties, try adjusting the volume settings on your device. If a telephone line goes dead during the call, hang up and call back again to the same number. If all lines go dead, watch the on-screen chat box for an alternative call-in number. Feel free to ask questions or provide feedback by using the chat box or questions box during the webinar. If you are using a tablet, you may need to tap on the screen for the options bar to appear, then you can select the appropriate option. We may not respond immediately, but we will work your questions or feedback into the presentation. If we can't get to your comment or question during the session, we will be online afterwards to respond, or we may follow up in an email if we run completely out of time. You may also email us at moderator@aspenrmg.com for up to 48 hours after the webinar. This will be a 1-hour presentation. Questions and comments are very much encouraged throughout, and the presenters will be answering questions at the end. And lastly, we have a number of upcoming webinars covering a variety of topics, including those listed at the Heffernan webinar website. In addition, we offer the mandatory preventing harassment training in English 3 times a year. With that, let's begin today's webinar, Exempt and Non-Exempt Employees. Turn the screen over to our presenter, read you her bio. So our presenter today is CJ Westrick. CJ has been in human resources management for over 25 years and received her Senior Professional in Human Resources National Certification in 2002. She started HR Jungle in 2006 and targets companies that want senior level HR expertise on a part-time basis. HR Jungle provides business owners and management teams workable solutions and hands-on assistance with employees and legal compliance through outsourced HR services. Thank you for being with us today, CJ.
Thank you. And so today we are obviously talking about exempt versus non-exempt. So we're going to go through the definitions, the penalties, and the exemptions, and hopefully provide you with enough detail to have a better idea of how to classify your employees. I always kind of like to start if there's things in the news on the topic, because I want you to understand how important some of these things are when they're legal questions. AT&T settled a class action for $28 million because it didn't pay overtime to its first level managers who they had classified as exempt, but turned out they were non-exempt. City Gear was accused of withholding over $25 million in overtime for 200 store managers and assistant managers. They paid a fixed salary, but they were also tracking hours and penalized people for not working a 45-hour work week. So again, it didn't meet the exemption rules. And Alaska Communication Systems misclassified its client account managers, its account executives, and senior managers. And that was a court or class action. It's still not decided, but they're looking back to 2010 and coming forward. So class action really pulls in a lot of people. And so that one's still pending. But just because these titles are in here, don't think that that necessarily applies to you. It's all very individualized. The various exemptions available and that we're going to cover today are executive, administrative, professional, outside sales, commissioned inside sales, and computer professionals. So we're going to jump right to the first polling question.
How much weight does the title carry in determining if the employee is exempt or non-exempt? And CJ, I had a question come in already. Did you want to address questions at the end, or
Sure.
did you want to answer it now?
Yeah, that's fine.
Right now or at the end? I'm sorry.
Now.
Okay, great. So someone asked, will you cover travel pay non-exempt? And what's the best practice for compensating NE for travel on a workday, but flight departs in the evening? This is pretty specific, huh?
Travel pay isn't part of this particular webinar because it goes into a whole pay thing that's very different. But typically, travel pay is paid if it's a non-exempt employee. You can in California, you can pay minimum wage if it's been notified. You've got a policy stating that up front, but that means it's for travel between one job location and another. Otherwise, commute is typically unpaid, and you don't pay mileage for that either if you're calling it a commute. That's about as deep as I can go without going way deeper.
Gotcha. All right, so we're going to close the polling question and read the results now. Okay, so we had 8% say 25%, 17% said 50%, and 10% said 100%, and 64% said none.
Well, the 54% is correct. Job title doesn't make them exempt. It has nothing to do with whether or not they're exempt. Title doesn't come into any of the decision points for that. And so keep that in mind. I mean, you can have somebody called a CEO and they can still be non-exempt. It's when you try to make them exempt that you have to meet other tests, not about the title. So, and usually most of the time when you get audited for this particular classification, I know they start with the assumption every employee is non-exempt hourly, unless you prove otherwise. So that means they have to meet the exemption salary and duties test, and they have to fit with one of those exemptions. You can't just decide that they are. You've got to actually be able to prove that they fit to one of those exemptions. When you are looking at doing an audit to make this, even if it's not like a big audit, but if you start looking into this in your company, it's really strongly recommended you talk to your attorney and just let them know what you're doing, because then if you keep it under the privilege, the client attorney privilege, if things go on outside, within this, and you don't make changes or you make them and you do something else, what you found in that audit doesn't become public knowledge or can't be subpoenaed because it would be under the privilege. So keep that in mind. If you don't talk to your attorney and get that umbrella over you to do this, then anything you find is open to whoever wants it. So let's look at some basic definitions. A non-exempt person, as I mentioned, is everyone unless they meet the exemption test. So a non-exempt is hourly employee. They are paid for the overtime hours, and how that overtime hits varies by state. California, they have basically two ways they do it. A daily overtime rate of like anything over 8 hours is overtime, and then also weekly. So if they didn't meet the daily, they might have hit the 40 hours over the week. Most states are 40 hours just throughout the work week. But it does get defined by the work week and stuff. They must meet the minimum wage rules, and the company has a lot more control over non-exempts because you can control their workload, you can control their hours. It's just something, and so it kind of depends on what type of position it is. When you're looking at exempt, what they are and why they're called exempt is because they are exempt from overtime pay and any meal and rest breaks that they may be due. So that's where the word exempt and exemptions come from. They're being exempt from that because that's the default is the non-exempt. They're not exempt. So hours are not counted, and I know in some states it's not even legal. California, you can't do comp time. Oh, I worked over all the weekend. Can I take I want to take a couple of days off. Well, that's not the life of an exempt employee. If you're tracking their hour by hour for anything other than job costing, in some states you would automatically be making them non-exempt because you're watching those hours. They must meet a minimum salary based on what the exemption is. And they have to meet a duties test. The salary is easy, and we'll get into that in a minute, but the salary is easier because it's more black and white. The duties test is where I've always gotten the arguments from clients on whether or not they qualify. But overall, an exempt person is judged by their performance, not their hours worked. And, if they can get something done in 2 hours a week and it's what you told them the job was, great. They've got 38 hours off each, work week. But, on the other hand, it's you have to judge, did they do what you asked? Did they, were they completing it? Were they doing it at the quality you needed and productivity, stuff like that? But you can't look at the hours anymore. So you have to have your metrics in place to know, or job description, so that you're very clear on what it is you expect from this person. So the first test is the salary test. This is a calculation, and for every state, it's 2 times the state minimum times 2,080 hours. The 2,080 hours is what has always been considered full-time at 40 hours a week. So you got a state minimum, and the 2 times state minimum, so it's going to move. Like right now, in the last few years, California, which is where I'm at, so that's why I mention it, California has been increasing its minimum wage $1 per year to get it up to the 15. But even now with inflation, now they're looking in January to making it $15.50 an hour. So every time that has gone up $1, salaries have had to go up about $5,000 because that state minimum changed. It doesn't matter, like California's got a lot of local different minimum wages. The locals don't count. It's strictly the state minimum. So if you're in a state with some local minimum wages too, ignore those for this purpose and just look at your state. And so if, like right now, if you have a state minimum wage of $15 an hour, your minimum annual salary is going to be $62,400. And when we talk minimum salary, it is the minimum this person is paid. So you can't prorate it. I've had a lot of people say, well, they're only working half the hour, so we cut the salary in half. And it's like, not allowed. The law says if you're going to call them exempt, they are getting that amount of money no matter how few or how many hours they work. The only time you can have an unpaid, and it gets very tricky on there, would be as if they're, actually starting work for you, and so they start midweek or they end midweek, something like that. Or, maybe go on a leave of absence. There's different things like that where maybe you can then prorate that week of salary. But overall, if somebody, I always tell people, it's right now in California, if you're considering making somebody exempt, I want to see that they're being paid at least like $65,000, because the other part of this is you can't have any unpaid time off. Oh, that's fine. I'm small. I don't have vacation time, so I allow a couple weeks of unpaid time. Not going to happen if you're right at the minimum, or that unpaid time is going to bring them down below the minimum for the year. So be very, very careful when you're trying to make somebody exempt, but you're running really close to that minimum, because it's going to come back and bite you at some point. Either the position won't now be worth that much, or the minimum wage will go up and you won't be able to justify it anymore. So keep that in mind. It can be very tricky. And I know the feds are actually working on a new federal minimum salary. They tried that, gosh, when was it? Maybe 5 years ago. They came up with this weird number. It was like, and they still have a weird number out there, like $47,476 per year was the minimum. But at that time, the southern states were only using federal minimum wage. So this almost doubled what they were able to pay in a salary. And but the feds are trying it again, mostly because they want you to believe that an exempt person has a lot of responsibility and carries weight in the company, and therefore they feel it should be paid a certain level. And but right now we're still using the 2 times state minimum. The big part, and where it gets really subjective, I think sometimes, is that most every exemption includes a phrase called customarily and regularly exercises discretion and independent judgment. I've had people, even when I worked inside, oh, it's like she's the clinical coordinator, but she was doing a desk job just in a different variety of what an admin or secretary would be doing. That's not making real decisions. When I talk about decisions, I'm looking for something that they could sign, a contract that would bind the company for like $25,000 or even $10,000. Most people don't have that authority. That they are free from immediate direction or supervision. You're letting them do what they do, and you're judging them on performance, but they are making decisions that could harm the company. And if they don't have that level of authority, then think twice about making them exempt. It does vary with each exemption on how these all play out, but that phrase is in most of them. So keep that in mind. So if we start with the executive exemption, this is meant to be for like the C-level people, the CEO, the CFO, and typically they are managing at least 2 full-time employees. They are, have the power to hire and fire. They're changing. They're spending more than 50% of their time on exempt duties. So that's in hiring people, training them, evaluating, controlling the flow or distribution of products. They're planning and directing work. They're setting pay rates and hours. This is a little bit higher level than some of the manager titles and stuff like that. And so keep that in mind, that this is meant to be pretty much key personnel. That's why I always say it's more like the C-level. They're running, or maybe a VP in your company. They're running a company or department. But one of the things I'm going to bring up here, because this has come up so many times with my clients and stuff, is usually directly manages at least 2 full-time employees. Back when the feds were talking about that $47,000 minimum salary, one of the other things they brought up, but it died fairly quickly, but I think it's a good thing to think about. If you only have 2 people reporting to you and one goes on vacation, the feds said, well, gosh, look, in that work week, they only had 1 person reporting to them. The other person wasn't working. So do they lose their exemption? This is why you want to be very careful when you use this, because if it goes into court and somebody's claiming that you've misclassified them, these are the kinds of things that will pop up. The most common is the administrative exemption. This is where you find most of your managers classified. It is, work directly related to the management policies or general business operations or to your customers. It does require that discretion and independent judgment we talked about. Staff employees who are functional rather than department heads may also qualify. For instance, if you're I know when I worked inside in one company, I was the only person technically in HR, company of 100. And so I didn't have any actual direct reports. Well, receptionist, I think, was under me, but I didn't have the 2. But I was running the whole HR function. And so I qualified as exempt for that reason. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a bunch of people under you so much as what is it that's your level of responsibility. All right, our second polling question.
Is your executive assistant or administrative assistant exempt? And I have quite a few questions coming in, so you want to go over one right now?
Sure.
Awesome. For an exempt employee, if they decide they want to go work as a contractor for a specific amount of time, let's say 10 days, can you not pay them for those 10 days because they are not working directly for you at that time?
If it doesn't lessen their annual meeting of the, minimum wage or minimum salary, you could. Basically, they're taking unpaid time off. And so that's where they can go do that, take a second job over there. And, but you don't see that happen very often with exempt level, because usually you need those exempt people in the company to keep it running. I've seen it more with the non-exempts where they go do something over here. Theoretically, they could. You'd need to, check into a lot more detail on that and what their pay is and everything like that. But possibly.
Okay. Awesome. So I'm going to close the polling question and share the results. We have 11% who said yes, 63% who said no, and 26% who said only the executive assistant.
Okay. So here's some administrative duties, just examples of some exempt level duties that I've seen in places. So you're advising management, you're making plan, you're creating a plan or a strategy, you're negotiating deals, you're representing the company in some fashion, with some authority. You have signing authority when purchasing things, you are promoting sales or researching business opportunities, you're analyzing business data. and determining company and or personnel policies. Now, you wouldn't necessarily be doing all of these, but this is a kind of, just like I said, an example of what they consider exempt level, because you're thinking more than doing when it comes down to it. The higher, have you noticed that the higher level somebody is in a company, the more they spend time just thinking than physically doing. And examples of exempt positions would be a financial consultant working for a firm, an accounting manager, maybe an HR manager. What's typically not actually exempt, that usually won't meet the full standards of the duties test, would be someone who you've labeled a supervisor or lead. Office manager, even though they've got the title manager, they're not really making big company decisions usually. Executive or administrative assistant, they're not making decisions either. They're doing what their boss has told them. And otherwise, everything's within a box. So think of it that way. A non-exempt person is usually working within a box the company has created. So there's a certain level of decision making, but it's modified. Okay, I order office supplies and I can spend up to $500. I make a decision. Well, it's not a very big decision. You've been given a limit of $500. You've kind of told who to buy from, stuff like that. So keep that in mind, that there's a lot of variation in the way this is all played out. And if it were all black and white, it'd make life so much easier, but they don't seem to be able to come up with something that can work for every type of industry. So you get this kind of thing that just builds in a lot of questions. And move to our next polling question.
Is a manager with 2 employees always exempt? We're waiting. We've got another question. Are you able to change an employee that is an exempt to non-exempt if their work changes?
Yes. And if it's like, if their work changes, absolutely. Sometimes you find, there's opportunities that you need to grab. If you found that you perhaps misclassified them, unless you're working with an attorney on how to deal with this, then to me, it's like, if minimum wage changes are coming up quickly, then I use that as an opportunity. Oh, minimum wage, therefore the position now is kind of outside of our range, so we're going to make you non-exempt instead. Because the moment, I'll get into this in a little while, but the moment they believe that you misclassified them, you may owe them a lot of money. So you need to do it very, very carefully and under an attorney's advice.
Very good. Okay. And so the results of our polling question are 14% said yes, 77% said no, and 9% said not sure.
Okay, so working managers. Anybody who's ever read about Starbucks probably has heard about their big lawsuits, because the big companies are the ones that are big targets. But that was part of it, was their store manager, who also acts as a barista when they're not busy doing their managerial stuff. Are they considered exempt or not? And this is where working managers, people who maybe you design the shift, like here's the hours, like in a restaurant. Okay, you set up the hours for the week for each of the servers, stuff like that. But then the rest of the time, you might be acting as a server yourself. So same with the Starbucks and the baristas. He may have to do a few things that are his managerial part, reporting into corporate for things. But then the rest of the day, he's doing the same work as the baristas. And so they have, kind of come out there that working managers are often not non-exempt, because first off, they only manage a few employees, and if they're a working manager, only having 2 or 3 employees really doesn't represent that much work most of the time for them. So they spend over 50% of their time doing exactly the same work as the people that report to them. So it's more of a, they've got a shared responsibility rather than directing employees. So it's messy. You want to be very careful if they're a working manager. This is where I said most companies don't call him manager. They might call him a supervisor instead, to give him, that symbolic, he's in charge when he's here kind of thing. But on the other hand, they're not really at the level of an exempt person. So you want to consider, how important are those managerial duties? Do they have that, is the frequency of that discretion, independent judgment? If it's only once a month, it's not going to meet the levels. Are they relatively free from supervision? And how is their wage? I mean, having another dollar an hour isn't going to cut it. But if they're, exempt, they've got to be at that minimum wage or minimum salary. So you want to look at the whole picture and see. So that's why I'm saying it's never about the title. You really have to dig into what the work is. And I've seen attorneys that have a form that they all seem to have the same form, but they want you to kind of list in there every single thing you're doing all day long, every day for a couple of weeks, really, to really get an idea of how often, some of these higher level duties come in. But when you're spending at least 50% of your time doing the same work as someone else, it's usually not going to be an exempt position. So our next exemption is professional. This has 3 categories to it: the learned, licensed, and artistic. Learned professionals are those that have an advanced degree, usually in a field of science or learning. So they've been fairly specific with this. It's law, medicine, theology, accounting, engineering, sciences, stuff like that, where you actually needed that level of learning to actually be able to do the work at a higher level. Sorry. So usually it's a prolonged course of specialized intellectual instruction. The work is predominantly intellectual in character. You're thinking it. You're not physically having to do a lot so much as really thinking through things. So you're analyzing, you're interpreting, you're deducing, and you're meeting the minimum salary test. Then there's the licensed professionals. These are people who are required by law to have a license or certificate, usually from the state. They have to meet the minimum salary, and it only covers certain fields. So again, we kind of go back to similar to what the learned was. The law and the legal, an attorney doesn't actually have a minimum salary, but if they don't have their JD degree, then they still are non-exempt. Teachers, there is no minimum salary. But you've got dentist, optometry, architecture, engineering, accounting, medicine, doesn't have a minimum salary. And I think some of that's because so many people, when they're a doctor, they end up being their own little corporation, but still working for someone. But the medicine can include degreed interns and residences. So it's more, with the medicine, it's more that they've done all the learning, they've got their degree, they just aren't yet fully licensed, I guess. I don't know, they get a license. I'm not quite sure where that division is there. But so you can see that they again have focused on things that they are keeping an eye on, in the sense that you have to get a license for it. So you had to be approved, pass a test, something, in order for the state to say, yes, you are able to do this. And, to go out there and use your license, hang your shingle up there. The professional exemptions. These are not automatically considered exempt. So you've got pharmacists, nurses, physicians that are paid hourly. So that's where you really got to get into the meat of what that person's doing and determine, because a pharmacist, he has a license, but it's like you look at your CVS or Walgreens or whatever is in your state or location, they're back there doing their thing, but they're not making a gazillion decisions. They're mostly a pharmacist is doing the same thing as their pharmaceutical assistants are, but they're the ones that have to come in and talk to you if you're getting a new prescription. So they have to use what they've learned, but it's different. They're not running things. Nurses, it can vary a lot. I know in California there's this document that all new businesses get, that's the IWC. It's the Industrial Welfare Commission order. And it's a California, like a Bible for hourly employees. It has 16 different versions of it. And if you pull up the one on nurses, it will tell you exactly which kind of nurses can be exempt versus non-exempt. It also will list how many hours someone in different professions can work and things like that if they're hourly. So it's something useful to work at. And one thing I've learned is that, and particularly I see this with nurses, because I have some clients with registered dietitians too, and a union contract can make a world of difference based on what you can and can't do. Union contracts will typically override most employment laws. I've got a couple of clients that have a union, which I'm not quite sure why these people pay for it to be in the union, because it doesn't allow them this paid sick leave that the state gives them. It doesn't allow them vacation, and I can't remember what else. It's like, okay, it was more like they took away benefits rather than giving them extra ones. But I've also seen there's a lot of hospitals that have unions. And I know some of my clients have told me, it's like, well, I've got an employee who's going to work, temporarily in a hospital, and they're working 12-hour days there, but they're, not getting paid overtime, and I have to pay overtime. Why is that? Well, it's because, that employee doesn't belong to the union. If there's a union, there's some things out there where I'm not figured out exactly how they're doing it legally, but they seem to be getting away with it. So I don't recommend doing something that you can't figure out the reason behind, and, and know that you're on solid legal ground. There's a lot of gray area in all of HR, but, something like this, because of the repercussions financially, if you do it wrong, you really want to check into it and have an attorney, provide advice if it's catchy at all, if you're trying to find out if there are any outs. Artistic. I've actually had this come up with somebody who was in a band, and it was a question of, okay, when we go play a gig, am I needing to get, do we have to pay the band members a minimum wage and things like that? And so there's some of this. It's like, if you're making a living at your art, then you might qualify as exempt, or, it's very weird, because some of it, like in a band, it might all be owners who don't work in the same way. But usually it's going to be where it's a recognized field of artistic or creative endeavor. I did have, and this is why it's so messy trying to come up with exempt versus non-exempt. I had a client that had opened up a big gym, and they had an ex-Olympiad running their gymnastics, and she was creating these things and doing training and stuff, and they were trying to get her exempt. And I had an attorney tell me, no, she's not really inventing the wheel. She just doing it over and over again. And so that's why you really want to have a strong clarity of where you're going with some of this and why you're trying to make them exempt. All right, another polling question.
So this one's a little long. I'm not sure if it's cut off on your screens. Is a sales rep who spends most of his time doing virtual demos of a product and making calls to prospects from a home office exempt? Yes or no? And so we've got questions I'm going to pose to you now, CJ. If the employer prohibits the employee from working overtime, but they do anyway, what can the employer do other than terminate the employee?
One of my favorite questions. Well, you obviously write them up for not following policy. And I've kind of developed this weird little disciplinary method to where, if after you've warned them, then I start, or even in the first warning, I give them a message. But basically, I have my 3-memo disciplinary action, that first time you get the memo that's warning you what's going to happen the third time you do a memo. The second one says, okay, if you get the third memo, then you're going to lose 50 cents or $1 an hour in pay because you're not following our policy. You can terminate, but you've lost an employee then. So, and just doing write-ups sometimes doesn't seem to make enough of a dent in the employee to want to do what your policy says. So you need to figure out what it is that's going to do that. I just recently had a client where we did 50 cents per hour for up to a certain period of time. And then if they did it again, it was $1 an hour. But then we discussed what happened if they were too close to minimum wage. And then they have a certain amount of hours of unpaid suspension as their disciplinary action. So there's things you just have to get a little creative and make sure it's legal, that you can do it. But there are some other creative things that you can come up with that will help get their notice and make them perhaps want to follow your policy.
Awesome. And so for the polling questions results, we have 29% said yes and 71% said no.
Okay. Outside sales. This one is, even when I worked inside, I've always worked with a nationwide sales force. And so this is kind of, my favorite exemption but it's the one that seems to get most abused anymore. And so to legally qualify for the outside sales exemption, there is no minimum salary, so they can be commission only. But they must spend 51% of their time, what I say is pounding the pavement. They've got to be out there knocking on doors, trying to make those sales at least 51% of the time. And most sales reps I know are spending more than that, 75% of the time trying to make sales, because that's where all their money's coming from. Even if they get a base, salary, the real money is in knocking on doors and getting those sales. So what I have found most interesting, because I have a lot, I've had clients that I know are not doing it right, and they just are choosing to ignore me because of the fact that my argument doesn't work well for them. So you've got somebody who is selling, I've got a couple clients that sell like big equipment. It's not something you're going to throw in the back of your car and cart into a client site hoping to sell it to them. So what they, one of them has this San Diego person who's residing in San Diego, and their territory is Northern California. So for those of you not in California, it's like clear on the other end of the state, because San Diego is just about as far south in the state as you can get. So his sales territory is clear in the northern side, and he does it by Zoom meetings or, any of these webinar type of things, because he can like demonstrate the machine, he can show it to him, he can talk with them kind of face to face, we'll say, and and do it that way. And I should have a polling question that asks whether or not you think that is legit, because I've talked to a couple of attorneys about it, and on this and a couple of other topics, they keep telling me that unfortunately the law has not kept up with technology. And this is one of those situations. If somebody's selling remotely, they are not meeting this qualification. So my sales rep over that's doing this thing on the northern thing, he would not qualify for this outside sales exemption. He should be paid hourly because he doesn't meet that exemption or any of the other exemptions. And so it's a problem. And if you think about it, we're almost, over 2 years in, easily over 2 years into COVID. That first year in 2020, not a single salesperson met this exemption. They were all misclassified because they couldn't go out and knock on doors. They just couldn't. They weren't allowed to. Everybody was sealed up tight. So you've got almost 2 years worth of outside salespeople's not doing it. They learned to do it remotely. I'll take a wild guess that many of them are still doing it. And, this is so much easier than going out and driving around all the time. I only have to make the top half of my body look good for the presentation on the computer. And so you've got a ton of people out there doing the sales thing, but they're not doing it legally. And, they have to be out there truly knocking on doors. I don't know at what point down the road that eventually, the laws will start to kind of pick up on some of this stuff. I had to laugh. It was only until, when was it? Late 2020, I believe. So we were almost, a year into COVID before California popped out a law that said, okay, we will allow you, to not, to have the I-9 form signed, remotely, temporarily. And it was, or the feds did that, I guess. And it was just the funniest thing. It's like, okay, what do you think people have been doing for the past year? And so it's things like that. You have to think through what's going on in your company and in life at the moment to see whether or not these exemptions hold. Just because somebody gets one and you can call them that at one point, it's not an automatic lifetime exemption. You have to be able to prove it every single day, because those claims come in every single day. And so you need to always be prepared. And this outside sales one, I think right now is probably the most abused, simply because of the fact that there's still people who are not refusing to go out knock on doors. They no longer want to do that or things like that, but they've lost their exemption if that's true. So now you're paying them an hourly wage, and it's painful because it's hard for somebody to be really successful in sales sitting in front of a computer. It's just not as good of a sales tool. And but that's kind of what we're stuck with right now. And so you want to look at your salespeople and see whether or not they actually still qualify and what, this means to your company. And I believe our last polling question.
Do you have exempt commissioned inside sales reps? Address one of our questions. Hello, I'm a 50% owner along with my husband of a site concrete subcontracting company with 17 employees. Some weeks I work 10 hours, some weeks I work 35 to 40. I take a fixed salary of $25,000 a year. Am I exempt, and is my salary amount acceptable?
This is one of those questions that pops up because owners seem to never be, I've never seen, let me put it this way, I've never seen an owner considered when looking at classifications, because they've got like the title of owner. And sometimes, because it's like, well, you might only take 25,000 out. On the other hand, you might be getting profits elsewhere. So it's not as simple when it's an owner to do that classification of like, oh, are you, making at least this amount? Because while you might only be getting that much in a salary, you are making potentially more money in other ways, whether it's through the value of the company and stuff. So I think that's why I've never really seen it pushed hard. I think the trickier one is when it's a corporation, because if you're incorporated, every person, including everyone is an employee of the corporation. There is no owner per se anymore. It's how much shares, how much of the corporation do you have? But I think that, given the circumstances, is probably a question better presented to an attorney who can look at your full, what's going on with you and stuff like that, because I found that the wage that an owner takes is rarely the only amount they ever get from a company. So it makes it a much more difficult question. It's not quite that simple, because they definitely are exempt in the sense that they're running things. But the minimum salary part, I think, is probably harder for owners to come to grips with than the duties test.
Awesome. And just to let everybody know, we've got about 30 questions in the queue. I don't believe we're going to be able to get to all of them by the end of this session. So we're probably going to have to do follow-up emails to everyone, but we'll do our best with the time we're allotted and go from there. But let's read the results of the polling question. Okay, so we have 29% who said yes and 71% who said no.
All right. So a commissioned inside sales person, I will typically try very hard to talk a client again, about using this. I don't like it at all because it's too picky. And if you're doing it correctly, it's picky. And Cox Cable had a big lawsuit on this quite a few years back. And so let me talk about it first and tell you how they got in trouble. So the commissioned inside sales exemption, you're only having an exemption from overtime. That's the only thing it saves you from. You still have to do a minimum pay of 1.5 times your state minimum wage or your local minimum wage. Commissions that the person earns must be more than half of their pay. And the commission must be paid every pay period. You can't do it monthly. You have to match your pay periods. And the commission must be for selling. So it's limited. Federal law says it's only for retail establishments. California law limits it to those types of industries that are under wage orders 4 and 7. So it's very, very picky. And where Cox Cable got into trouble was that they were only paying a monthly commission. And the courts flat out said, no. In order for commissions to be half their pay, then the commissions have to be paid every pay period. And I'm not sure if other states are as picky as I know they're not as picky as California in general, but on the commission, California has defined a commission is earned as only, it's bonus versus commission. A commission is only earned if the person earning that commission had an active role in making the sale. Otherwise, it's considered a bonus, not a commission. So there's a lot of moving parts in here. And frankly, with all these pieces and the only thing you're getting out of it is not having to pay overtime, I just don't see it's worth the extra administrative work that this causes. So I'm not a fan of this particular one, but it is there and it's available to you if you want to jump through those hoops. Then there's the computer-related exemption. So again, this meets a minimum salary test. They no longer require a degree. I think they did at one time. Actually, no, I'll take that back. They didn't even have this at one time. I think some of this computer stuff came up when California, that Silicon Valley, had the dot-com bust, and tons of IT people were out of work and stuff like this. So they started putting some stuff, at least the California one put in a special law just for the California people. But the work is intellectual or creative. So it's not your IT manager in your company is not going to qualify for this. They might qualify for the manager, the administrative exemption, but they're never going to qualify for this because they have to be designing. You can't be just working on a system. You have to be designing a program or a system, things like that. So it's not for the low end people. So it's going to be like your computer system analysts, the programmers, the software engineers. These are people that are not using someone else's software. They're creating things. And so you really want to look into this if you've got people doing it, but it really does vary in which state you're in. Federal law, it's a minimum salary, so it'd be that 2 times minimum wage. California law, then the number changes every single year. But it's usually been about $100,000 a year that you have to pay these people. And in California, some of them might even still be able to earn overtime. So California really jumped on this one because of that .com being in California at the time. And so I've only got one client with employees that qualify for this. And there are, those employees, I don't think they've got any that are paid under $20,000. So they don't have any problem meeting this minimum, or whatever. California keeps moving it around because it moves around based on cost of living, stuff like that. I don't know what all they do, but it's always some weird number. And, but, these are people that are creating special programs for each client. And so it's, but most people that are just working on a system of stuff aren't going to meet this. So you want to kind of pay attention to that. All right, now, when you misclassify someone as exempt, I'll tell you right now, the company is always going to be totally held responsible for the misclassification. And there's penalties and fines and more, actually. So the employee doesn't get to decide what wasn't paid. So gets to decide. Okay, so what happens is, and I've had to do this before because I had an attorney introduced me to one of my clients, and they were going through a class action lawsuit based on unpaid overtime and some missed meal breaks, which in California you have to do, or you have to pay a 1 hour penalty each day that happens. So anyhow, I had to sit individually in front of 150 employees with a calendar, 4 years worth of calendars, which in California, they can go back 4 years on any of this stuff. And I had to say, mark every day on here, you believe you worked some overtime and didn't get paid for it, or that you missed a meal break. One guy took a look at my calendar, he goes, every Monday I missed my meal break. Now, in the class action, the company had to just write a check to these employees for whatever the employee said they didn't get. That was just to try and pull that part off the class action claim. So it's really messy out there because depending on your state, you're going to have penalties because you misclassified. And so that means we're looking at potential overtime. And if they're exempt, typically you don't have time cards. So you have nothing to argue it with. Instead, the employee can say, oh, no, I worked an extra 2 hours every single day, so you owe me all that money. And how are you going to fight that? And then there's the fines, because of if you didn't claim it and pay the proper amount, you didn't pay the payroll taxes that go according to that. And I know California, and I'm sure they're not the only state, has an actual agreement with IRS. It's like, okay, when we're done with you, we automatically turn you over to IRS and they'll go through it with theirs. So you need to pay attention to this. There's actually quite a few different agencies out there. I think there's like 7 different agencies that get a little piece of something out there if you're misclassifying people. And so they'll all come, looking for their part of it if you're not careful about how you do this. So that's why you want to be really, careful on classifying someone as exempt. I'm always leaning toward, it's like, well, I've got a client that has estimators and they're in construction. And so they get someone new in and they're calling like a junior, I had them come up with a new title. Let's call them a junior estimator because they haven't quite got enough experience with your company where you can turn a blind eye and they will submit, exactly the right thing every time. For at least 6 to 9 months, somebody higher up from them is having to look over that estimate before it gets sent to make sure that there wasn't anything big missed that's going to cost the company a lot. And that's part of that. If they are exempt, they have the right to send it out there and the company eats it if the estimate wasn't large enough. And so this is why, it's like, okay, let's keep them as a junior estimator for a period of time until nobody's having to look over their work anymore. Then you can promote them into an exempt level estimator position so that that they're out there on their own and they're able to do it without any kind of supervision. So kind of think in terms of that, what is it going to cost you if you're wrong and made them exempt too soon? And so when you look at what it's going to cost you, it's for any unpaid overtime worked. And again, usually 90% of the time it's going to be the employee saying exactly how much overtime that is because you've got no records. If you're in a state with paid, or with paid rest breaks that are required, you're going to have to pay for those. You're going to have to pay for any missed meal, and rest. There's penalty pay. Like if they had missed rest breaks, theoretically, because like on piece rate pay, you have to pay piece rate rest breaks separately so that you can show that they actually got a paid rest break. In California, we have that penalty pay. So if they missed both a meal and both rest breaks, you owe them 2 extra hours of pay every single day. And then there's going to be the federal and the state penalties and fines and interest and the attorney fees. It gets very expensive. When you misclassify as a non-exempt, nothing happens because that's the default. Hold on a second. Sorry, I've been fighting, trying to pretend I'm not getting a cold, but this talking for an hour is starting to get to me. But, this is why it is the default, because it is the safest thing. If you start people at non-exempt and then make sure that they're at a level that you're very confident that they qualify for one of the exemptions, then fine. That's when you move them. But I would, make sure that you don't have any doubts. If you're on the fence, then go with non-exempt because everything costs you more, when they're exempt, and you've got less control over that person too. So my recommendations are that you are very conservative. I always lean toward conservative. And if I really, have a question, I will talk to an attorney about it, trying to get like a sanity check on it. Make sure you train your managers to where they're not saying something about, oh, this person's, definitely exempt, and that they understand the differences and, recognize that, hourly employees have certain things that often more rights, just if we're only talking about the overtime, then they have to manage that time. And you want to educate your senior manager. Know for your state, what are those risks if you misclassify? Because the biggest argument I get all the time from clients, from other, managers and stuff like that is, well, it's just so much easier. They don't want to have to fill out a time card. Oh, and it's like, well, too bad. It's, too much risk to the company if they don't. And it's not something you want to just allow to happen. I've seen several like administrative assistants, well, they will only work for us if we give them a salary. And, it's like you've got people that should be non-exempt that they see that salary, that exemption as a feather in their cap in some way. But yet if you talk to most exempt employees, they would love to be non-exempt and get that overtime pay. And so it's kind of a weird little, wilted feather in the cap as far as I'm concerned. And but the employee does not have a say in it. And you have to keep reminding yourself of that. The employee cannot dictate whether or not they should be exempt or non-exempt. If they really want to be exempt, then it's like, okay, you give them a couple of those exemptions and say, okay, you pick out here and you justify why you believe you're exempt. Because I'll guarantee you, like an admin assistant is never going to make the level of decisions required to truly meet the duties test. They're spending way too much of their time doing the rote stuff. They're on the computer, they're doing this or that, but they're not making any decisions, and their work doesn't require a great deal of intellectual thought or not. I mean, it's not like they're dummies. They do a lot for, the people they work for, but it's still not at the level of running a department or making big decisions on how we're going to find our next, product for the company, things like that. And, but then also, when you're ready and you find that you have to reclassify some people, definitely talk it over with your attorney and see if they agree with you, if they have a better way of making those changes for you so that they're less risky, things like that. And that's it. So we can answer a few of the questions.
All right, let's get started. Give me a moment, please. Okay. By unpaid time off, do you mean if the employee is not given PTO time or vacation time?
Correct. It's truly, they're just not going to get paid through any method.
If you are working for a nonprofit, do the same salary calculations apply?
Sadly, yes. The only thing I've ever found with a nonprofit that's different is their bookkeeping methods. But the laws are the same for churches, for nonprofits, for any kind of business.
Perfect. And I have someone who said, I work in healthcare and have several coders. They have to use discretion and judgment in coding for patient care. Would this qualify? They also work together when they have coding issues.
I don't think it would. I think it would only be non-exempt because, again, they're not creating the code. They're having to just find one that fits in there. And yeah, I know, that they can make mistakes and stuff like that, but it's still not creating the wheel particularly. So I think they would be non-exempt just on the surface.
Okay. I have a staff accountant that runs the AP department. I was considering making her administrative exempt. She seems to meet the duties.
It does sound like she would.
Okay. What if the employee makes decisions based on clients they manage, but they don't make company decisions? And I apologize if some of these questions are kind of specific to slides, so I'm not giving you the context behind the question.
It's like making decisions for the client is not the same as making decisions for the company you work for, because the company you work for is the one who's deciding whether or not. And my guess is that any advice you're giving a client is based on what your company has told you you can do, or when you should get another opinion from someone inside the company about what to do.
If an employee has international relations and needs to be available and interacting in early morning and late evening meetings, considered to be an exempt at an associate level?
Not probably. It's, that's, because of the fact that they're still in an associate level. I think, again, it goes, just because it's international and have weird hours, and that I know everybody wants to go exempt for that and pay a salary so they don't have to worry about those different times and zones and stuff. I think you really need to look at the work itself, though, to determine whether or not it could be an exempt position, not at the hours.
Is there any condition where you are required to make someone exempt?
No.
What about employees who are salary non-exempt? I have PAs that are salary non-exempt, and they get paid for short days, their full hours, and on long days they get paid for overtime and double time. Is this correct?
Okay. So salaried and hourly are payroll terms. Exempt and non-exempt are the legal terms. So when you've got a salaried non-exempt, it means that they're still not exempt. They have to meet all the normal non-exempt rules. The only difference is that in payroll, you have agreed, sadly, to pay them the same amount every pay period. But that means every pay period, you also have to go in and make sure you have to do an audit every single pay period to make sure they got paid sufficient hours. And a salary will never, ever work for a company who's paying semi-monthly, because a semi-monthly is 86.67. This will get thrown out of court every single time because they'll say, well, no, they're not. They're either working 80 hours or 88 hours in that semi-monthly period. So you're not paying them correctly somehow. And so it's just, that's one of those, again, that I say that somehow the employee has convinced the company that they have to be salaried and the company's trying to comply. But I don't necessarily go that direction because it means more work for the company of having to audit it and make sure there aren't any missing hours that they have to cover and write another check for that employee.
Okay. And so everyone knows it's 11 a.m. So we understand if you have to leave the session. CJ, I'm curious as to how you want to address the rest of the questions.
Well, I'm good for like another 10 minutes or so if you want to try and do them, or else we can do it by email.
Sure. Let's go through for the next 10 minutes. If everybody, whoever needs to leave, you're welcome to do so. But for those who want to stick around, we're going to go through another probably about 20 or 30 questions if we can get to them. Okay. So here's the next question. Is it typical that someone who thinks more than doing and who manages staff, in other words, a role which includes promoting sales or acts as director of care, is exempt?
It sounds like on the surface that would be exempt.
Okay. For learned, is this where years of experience can be substituted for education?
Not in the same way. I don't think so, because while on a job, on an ad or something, you might say like a bachelor's degree or, 4 or 6 years of experience. For these, they're very specific on saying it has to be an advanced degree. And they're not just talking years. I think instead you would try and fit them under one of the other exemptions.
Okay, how about a notary license?
Notary license isn't going to qualify you necessarily because you're doing very much working inside a box. Exactly what the notary people have told you can do. You're doing something, you're not making big decisions on other than, do they meet the rules of what you need to see for ID and stuff like that. So typically, if that's the only role they play, they're not going to be exempt.
Okay. Sorry, this is kind of a tricky question to read. Do even new grads of architecture included in professional designation?
Not usually, because usually if they're newly graduated, they may not have their license yet and they're not working independently yet. So that's where it's kind of like that estimator example. It's like, I think they come in as like a junior architect and they wait until they're actually creating plans themselves before they maybe qualify as exempt.
We need to be licensed in the insurance industry. Does that count?
No, because I know that's one of the, even the admin people have to be licensed if they want to talk to customers. So I don't consider that a high enough duties test to, they're not spending more than 50% of their time on exempt level work. It happens to be one of the requirements of their industry that they need to be licensed to do it at all.
What about someone who is the project accountant or AP supervisor, but she manages the entire AP department because she's the only one doing that function? She makes decisions to implement new processes or software, heads up those projects, does all of the AP functions, has ability to process large dollar payments, updates SOPs, and does a variety of business process functions along with the tasks necessary for this position.
A lot of detail in that one. On the surface, I would say it probably could qualify as exempt.
Okay. Is the minimum salary test just wages, or does it also include benefits?
Just wages. I will say there was something I had that an attorney did once, but I never could figure it out. And when I asked him about it, it was months later. I asked him about how he came up with that number. He couldn't even figure out what he had done. So it's like, because he had been taking like a bonus, but bonuses and things like that don't usually count toward it in benefits because of the fact that they're not guaranteed. Whereas, you're paying somebody, you're guaranteeing a certain amount each time.
We have someone requesting the reference that you were speaking about regarding the nurses. Is that something we should follow up in an email, or would you like to?
I think this is the one that did the question in advance. And yeah, so she can follow up with an email and then she can ask me what I didn't cover in this, because it was hard with as specific as she got in that email to speak much more to the whole group.
Sure. If pharmacists are required to have a license, how do they not fall under the licensed professional exemption?
It's again going to be depending on the actual job in the company they work for and what they're doing, because just because they got a license doesn't automatically guarantee. It's like, I know when I worked inside, we had a lot of PhDs who were taking research associate positions because they couldn't get a job at a higher level of a scientist position, which would have been exempt. Pharmacists, I believe, are probably in that same kind of category. It's not that he couldn't be exempt, but it depends on exactly what his job duties are where he's working.
Okay, and I'm sorry, I don't know the context of this question, but they said, how does that work with COVID? All of a sudden, people who were exempt then weren't.
I think it was kind of ignored during COVID, to be honest, just like my outside sales reps. I haven't heard of any big lawsuits that came from that, as far as misclassifications and things like that. And I don't think anybody made any big changes during COVID. But I think now that we always feel like we're coming out of it, but then not quite. I think it's one of those things that you want to keep an eye on. One of those things that's changing and doesn't seem to ever going to go back to what it was. And but we're now past the most intense part of COVID, I'll say that, to really take another look at all of these people and the positions, and to see, has the position changed? Because I know a lot of positions are remote now, and it does change some of what kind of work they're doing and who they're supervising.
Can I-9s be electronic? We use an HR software that allows for electronic signature and uploading ID to support the I-9.
Okay, so I-9 isn't really part of this, but I know that I-9, if you look in the directions for it, you can have a person fill it out electronically, but Homeland Security still requires a wet signature, so an actual signature on the form. And right now they've been still allowing remote view of the ID, and they're talking about it. By the end of the year, I'm hoping, cross all of our fingers, that they will decide that we can continue using a remote view of the ID, because that was another one of those laws haven't caught up with technology that I had mentioned earlier, that I've been harping on the digital view, like in a Zoom meeting or something, where you can just look at somebody putting their ID up on the screen. And the attorneys kept saying, no, no, no. But, we were able to do it temporarily. And then, the idea was we had to actually look at it. But the wet signature hasn't gone away. I know there's a lot of HRSs that allow it. So I'd be careful about it.
If the outside rep is on 100% commission, are they exempt even if they sell from the home or phone calls more than 50% of the time?
No, they can be commission only, but they have to meet the exemption, or you're having to pay them hourly. Because if they're sitting at home doing it remotely, then they are closer to that inside commissioned sales rep, which is, that paying and paid hourly.
We are a small nonprofit. Can we hire a 1099 consultant to do accounting services such as tax returns, or a fixed fee of $1,000 for their service? Or can we hire a 1099 consultant to help on a fixed project such as a database cleanup?
Yeah, usually, you can hire contractors who are going to help the company do something that's not the company's work. So if you've got like HR, marketing, accounting, those you can usually outsource those services and have somebody come in and do it. A special project, if you don't have that skill in-house, you can outsource it usually also to a contractor.
Are pastors always considered exempt due to their self-employed status?
Typically, yes. It's because of the fact that they are overseeing. I know they've got like a board and whatnot, but they are overseeing what's going on in the church for the most part. So they would and could qualify for an exemption.
And I believe you already addressed this question, but just to confirm, do benefits count toward the minimum salary requirement for exemption? You said no, right?
No, they don't.
Sorry if you mentioned this earlier, but I'm sorry. Forgive me for that one. I have a director of IT that oversees, manages, and resolves issues and leads projects. His salary is well above the minimum. Is this okay?
Yeah, if they're overseeing all of the IT and stuff like that, as long as they're going to be doing is the administrative exemption, and so typically that could qualify under that.
We are a consulting services company. We offer software and hardware design, implementation, and test services. We classify all employees as non-exempt, but we understand that we aren't required to pay overtime. Is this correct? By the way, employees report all their hours and we pay hourly rates on a monthly basis.
Okay, so the hour, paid as a non-exempt is always going to be legal. So, they can do that. I think usually it's more that people are trying to find ways to qualify someone as an exempt employee and only pay a salary. However, I will say, at least in California, hourly employees must be paid at least twice per month. You cannot pay only monthly. You can only pay an exempt person monthly. So check your state and find out what the rules are there and fix it if you need to.
Okay, so we are at our 10-minute overtime. Unfortunately, we still have quite a few questions to go through, so I think we're going to have to follow up on an email. Does that sound good to you,
Okay.
AJ?
Yeah.
Awesome. All right, well, thank you everyone for attending today's webinar presented by Heffernan. We will send information by email with instructions on how to access a copy of the presentation on our website. Thank you, CJ Westrick, for your time and expertise today. We hope all the attendees found today's webinar to be a valuable use of their time. Be sure to join us on August 16th for the Employment Law Mid-Year Update webinar. And thank you and have a safe day, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.